102, where we will focus primarily on placement preferences, court findings, and why they matter. So for those of you who I have not yet had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Geneva Shaw, and I am the Training and Curriculum Development Director for California Tribal Families Coalition. If folks who are joining virtually would care to introduce themselves in the chat or where you're tuning in from, that would be lovely. So I have, this is really fun. So my colleague is pulled up the PowerPoint from wherever she is located, and she will be advancing the slides. So interesting that I will not actually be driving the PowerPoint, and we'll be tag teaming from very different locations. All right, so here we go. Next slide. A little bit about our time together today. We'll do a bit of context setting regarding the history of placements. We will go over the ICWA placement preferences and processes, and we will touch on some family finding best practices, and we will do a little bit of practical application of knowledge depending on how we do with time. Next slide. So a quick knowledge check. All right, multiple choice answer. Feel free and be brave. You can write it down on your own, or if you want to shout out answers, that's super welcomed as well. Question we have before you, pop quiz. So historic biases have contributed to tribal children getting lost in the foster care system. How and why are tribal children and families disconnected from their tribes? And feel free and drop it in the chat for our virtual participants. Is it A, federal policies that were geared at assimilation, relocation, the Indian child adoptive practices, and boarding schools? Is it B, historic bias in child welfare practices and assessment? C, self-isolation, so maybe due to substance abuse, unhealthy coping mechanisms, etc. Is it D, guilt and shame due to not having opportunities to learn about tribal culture? Or is it E, all of the above? So we have an overwhelming response of E, all of the above. Next slide. All right, all of the above. Sorry I don't have any prizes, but y'all are doing great. All right, I got another one. So when must the ICWA placement preferences be applied? Is it A, only when the tribe has intervened in the case? Is it B, only when the child is enrolled in a federally recognized tribe? Is it C, in any and all ICWA cases, all the time, consistent with the tribe's designation of order of placement preferences? Or D, only when a suitable home can be found in partnership with the tribe? What do we think? C. I'm hearing C. What about in the chat? I see C. Next slide. There you have it, folks. C it is. In any and all ICWA cases, all the time, consistent with the tribe's designation of order of placement preferences. Next slide. We are not done yet, folks. Under which circumstances would there be good cause to deviate from the ICWA placement preferences in the placement of an Indian child in foster or adoptive placement? Is it A, if the case is at an advanced stage and compliance with the ICWA placement preferences will require a disruption of the current placement? Is it B, when the child has been placed in a non-ICWA compliant placement and evidence presented establishes the child has a normal attachment and bond to the placement? Or is it C, when no preferred placement is available after a diligent search? Or is it D, all of the above? What do we think, folks? Under what circumstances would there be good cause to deviate from the ICWA placement preferences? I hear a C. I see a D in the chat. Next slide. It is C, when no preferred placement is available after a diligent search being keyword, and we will talk about that a little bit more. All right, so we have a video. This is the context setting around kind of the history of why, how, and why placement preferences came to be in part and are so critically important to the heart of an ICWA case. Are we able to push play from my virtual PowerPoint driver? Let's see if this will work. Part of the significance of this video too is that, again, it lays the historical context and helps us remember and remind us that ICWA was passed as a remedial statute, meaning that it was passed intended to counter past harms that were inflicted upon our peoples prior to the passage of the act. So prior to the passage of ICWA, there were active efforts to break up our families, active efforts to sever the bond between tribal family, community, culture, homelands. And so one of those key provisions of the act are active efforts to prevent the breakup of the Indian family. Again, thinking about the remedial purpose of the act and all of those provisions of the act being remedial or counter in nature to remedy and counter past harms. You're doing great, PowerPoint driver. See if we can get sound. It's a crapshoot. Yeah, it's probably in the other room. Yeah.
Idea that they were saving me.
Saving us not from ourselves.
Being saved, and I should be grateful for the life that I've been given, because any child on the reservation would give anything to live as I was living.
They took us away from our mom. They came marching right in and literally took us and thousands of other children from their home.
It's a way to eradicate us and to go to a nation.
Sorry, folks.
So we might have to, I'll give Micah another minute until she tells me green light or not, but we may end up having to skip the video and certainly post it in the chat if necessary.
Children is one of the sure ways to do that.
Okay.
The U.S. has a long and brutal legacy of attempting to eradicate Native Americans. For centuries, they colonized Native American lands and murdered their populations. They forced them west and pushed them into small, confined patches of land. But Native Americans resisted. A Board of Indian Commissioners report said, instead of dying out under the light and contact of civilization, the Indian population is steadily increasing. And that was an obstacle to total American expansion. So the US found a new solution to absorb and assimilate them. It all started with an experiment and a man named Richard Henry Pratt.
He had in his charge some prisoners of war, and he taught these men how to speak English, how to read and write, and how to do labor. He dressed them in military uniforms and basically ran an assimilation experiment. And then he took his results to the federal government and said, they're capable of being civilized. So he was able to get this project funded.
In 1879, the government funded Pratt's project, the first ever off-reservation boarding school for Native American children. His motto was to kill the Indian and save the man. What started there at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School was nothing short of genocide, disguised as American education. Children were forcibly taken from reservations and placed into the school, hundreds, even thousands of miles away from their families. They were stripped of their traditional clothing, their hair was cut short. They were given new names and forbidden from speaking their native languages.
To take our children and to indoctrinate them into Western society, to take away their identity as Indigenous peoples, their tribal identity. I think it's one of the most effective and insidious ways that the US did do harm to Indigenous peoples here, because it targeted our children, our most vulnerable. And they tried to make us ashamed for being Indian, and they tried to make us something other than Indian.
There are also accounts of mental, physical, and sexual abuse, of forced manual labor, neglect, starvation, and death.
My great-grandfather went to Carlisle, and nobody in my family ever talked about it. So if you Google Indian boarding schools, the majority of the pictures that you will see will be actually from Carlisle. Colonel Pratt created propaganda. He hired a photographer to create those before and after photos to show that his experiment was working. So it was, intentional propaganda.
And it worked. The Carlisle model of education swept the country and led to the creation of over 350 boarding schools to assimilate Native American children.
On the one hand, we have the Navajo as we find him in the desert. Few of these boys and girls have ever seen a white man. Yet, through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of civilization.
In 1900, there were about 20,000 Native American children in these schools. By 1925, that number more than tripled. Families that refused to send their kids to these schools faced consequences like incarceration at Alcatraz or the withholding of food rations. Some parents who did lose their children to these schools even camped outside to be close to them. Many students ran away. Some found ways to hold on to their languages and cultures. Others, though, could no longer communicate with family members. And some never returned home at all. By stripping the children of their Native American identities, the US government had found a way to disconnect them from their lands. And that was part of the US strategy. During the same era in which thousands of children were sent away to boarding schools, a number of US policies infringed on their tribal lands back home. In less than 5 decades, 2/3 of Native American lands had been taken away.
The whole thing was purposeful. And the fact that it has been buried in the history books and not acknowledged is also intentional. And in fact, the same tactics were used in New Zealand, Australia, Canada. All of these countries have acknowledged, apologized, or reconciled in some way, except for the United States.
Over time, the brutality of boarding schools started to surface. And after a 1928 report detailed the horrific conditions at some schools, many began to close. In the 1960s, Indigenous activism rose alongside the civil rights movement. And by the 1970s, that activism forced more schools to shut down. The government handed over control of the remaining boarding schools to tribes to be run in partnership with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But just as the boarding school era started fading, another assimilation project took shape: adoption. The main goal of this pilot project was to stimulate the adoption of American Indian children to primarily non-Indian adoptive homes. They claimed it was to promote the adoption of the forgotten child, but it was essentially a continuation of the boarding school assimilation tactics. And the strategy came with a financial advantage for the government too. Adoption was cheaper than running boarding schools. But first, adoption officials had to sell white America on the idea of adopting Native American children. Feature stories like this one in Good Housekeeping marketed them to white families. They were described as unwanted, and adoption gave them a chance at new lives. In the end, their media campaign worked. White families wanted Indian adoption. But the problem was, many of these children were not orphans that nobody wanted. They were kids often ripped apart from families that wanted to keep them.
You still will hear stories today of people, my age, older, saying, I remember as a child, the social worker was coming and people would hide their children.
On reservations, social workers used catch-all phrases like child neglect or unfit parenting as evidence for removal. But their criteria was often questionable. Some accounts describe children being taken away for living with too many family members in the same household.
An extended family is a big thing for Native people. And that means being judged for being in a house that's overcrowded. So it's always whiteness is the standard for success. And everything else is judged by that standard.
By the 1960s, about 1 in 4 Native children were living apart from their families. The official Indian Adoption Project placed 395 Native American children into mostly white homes, but it was just one of many in an era of Native American adoptions. Other state agencies and private religious organizations began increasingly making placements for Native American children too.
My mother giving me up was a white person telling her if she didn't, she would never see her other kids again.
In one of the documents I have, it's addressed to my biological father, Victor Fox, that he was trying to look us up to get a hold of us. But Hennepin County wrote, Daniel and Douglas are adapting very well in their new family. This was totally, it was a false statement.
When you're adopted, you know you're missing something. I think I've likened it to having like when someone has like a 500-piece puzzle and they have all the pieces to make this pretty picture except one.
My adopted mother was not well, verbally, physically, and sexually, and spiritually abusive. So by the time I was 14, I started drinking. 15, drugs were added, and I became an addict to numb. I didn't realize I was numbing pain.
I tried suicide, tried slicing my wrist one time.
Children were taken and believed like I believed for a long time. That there was something wrong with me versus something wrong with the system.
The Indian Adoption Project was considered a success by the people who set it in motion. Officials claimed, generally speaking, we believe the Indian people have accepted the adoption of their children by Caucasian families and have been pleased to learn the protection afforded these children. But the truth was unsettling.
These hearings on Indian children's welfare is now in session.
I was pregnant with Bobby and the welfare kept coming over there and asking me if I'd give him up for adoption.
Before he was even born?
Yeah. They picked up my children and placed them in a foster home. And I think that they were abused in a foster home.
4 years after Native people organized in this Senate hearing, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, known as ICWA.
It gives tribes a place at the table in court.
States would be required to provide services to families to prevent removal of an Indian child. And in case removal was necessary, they would have to try to keep the child with extended family or another Native American family.
Without our relatives, we cease to exist. So with Native people, part of our wealth is in our family. It's in who we're connected to.
But the legacy of family separation in Native communities has been difficult to fully undo. Today, Native American children are 4 times more likely to be placed in foster care than white children, even when their families have similar presenting problems. In these cases, ICWA is often the best legal protection they have, and it's been under attack repeatedly.
A young girl ripped from her foster family because of the Indian Children Welfare Act.
White adoptive families intent on keeping Native American children have tried to do away with the act, and they're often backed by conservative organizations.
The Indian Child Welfare Act was dealt a blow earlier this month.
The subject of a lawsuit issued on Tuesday by the Goldwater Institute, arguing that preferences given to American Indian families to adopt Indian children is unconstitutional and discriminates based on race.
It's a way for these industries, these very powerful industries, to try to attack what Indian identity is.
Wanting to overturn ICWA is connected to everything about who we are as a nation. So if we don't have any protections for our families, and if we don't have protections for our treaties, then we have no more Indians.
We've been under attack. We're going to continue to be under attack. And we have to just keep fighting.
It's in our DNA to survive.
We are nations that pre-exist European contact, and we are still here.
So for some of us, that is likely not new information, new history. Some of us may still be learning the history that led up to the passage of the act. I like to, even when it's not new information and we are familiar with this history, I think it always still holds a place when we come together to, be re-inspired in this work, to be re-energized, but also to continue to build our own muscle around explaining to others, why ICWA, or why do tribal peoples, tribal children get special protections, or why is the tribe, advocating so fiercely to comply with the placement preferences? Like, we have a responsibility to also kind of flex that education in a way that others can absorb it, others can understand it, because, we know not everybody knows this information. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily common knowledge and common history that is shared in a lot of our educational experiences. So, when you hear your coworker of just like, I got an ICWA case, or, why this or why that, or why are we doing this, or why is this built into it, that we can be a part of that kind of extension of learning, of advocacy, and also to remind us like why we work so hard to complete our diligent efforts to comply with the placement preferences of the act. Next slide. Thank you, Micah. So due to that history, right, the history of intentional removal, intentional separation, intentional adopting out, intentional disconnecting from, between Indian children and Indian parents, one of the key provisions of the act is around placement preferences, right, and placement standards. So we know that the Indian Child Welfare Act created placement preferences for Indian children that apply to all state court cases as a response to past harmful practices and policies. Next slide. So what are those placement preferences? Placement being such a critical piece of collaboration between the family and the tribe and the county, but it also is a point sometimes of disagreement or contention or even misunderstanding, not only about what the responsibilities are around the diligent efforts to comply, but also like around issues of attachment and bonding, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But first, just to show folks here what those placement preferences are. We've been talking a lot about in different kind of threads of conversation over the course of the last 2 days, that, placement with family is always preferential, and that ICWA is the gold standard of child welfare practice, partly in that is such a priority, that is such a heartbeat of ICWA itself. And now we've seen child welfare efforts move in that direction for all families, that those efforts to keep kids connected with family, placed with family is the most preferred option. So you see here before you, and this is in kind of a descending preference order, number 1 being a member of extended family. And then you can see 2 through 4 here as well. Those are a little bit different for adoptive placements. Number 1 still being, of course, with extended family. And just note that doesn't necessarily differentiate between, tribal extended family and non-tribal extended family, like family is family. Next slide. Yes. Oh, yes. Thank you. Of course. Thank you. I know. All right. So at a minimum, so we, touched on like diligent efforts. Like, what is that? Number one, those diligent efforts should be thoroughly documented in the work that we're doing. So who was contacted, when they were contacted, what the follow-up was, what the response was, what barriers were removed from, the potential family member or community member who might be able and willing to provide placement. We also know that if we're doing good inquiry, right? So inquiry is happening at the beginning when we're identifying whether or not this is an Indian child. And as that work is happening, you're also identifying like who this child is connected to, right? So in documenting if they might be an Indian child and which tribe they might be connected to, there is documentation and contacts of a lot of different folks kind of really hone down on that specific piece of information. So when we're doing inquiry, we already come to the family finding process with a full body of folks to pull from for, seeking out potential placement options. So at a minimum, Child Welfare Agency is required to perform again and thoroughly document those diligent searches by contacting at a minimum the following. So certainly the child's tribe themselves, if they have a social services agency or an ICWA representative or whoever the tribe has designated for that role, contact with the child's extended family, of course, contact with other tribes or Native organizations. So sometimes maybe there is, a tribal TANF program or an Indian health program or other folks in the community of the child who, could potentially be resources for placement or know of potential placement resources. And certainly also searching any state and county list of foster homes. If you want to kind of dial down even further on some of the requirements associated with placement preferences and family finding, you can reference the All County Letter 1842. Next slide. All right, so all of this work that we do associated with implementing and complying with the Indian Child Welfare Act is really fundamentally grounded in teaming and collaboration, right? These efforts should, every bit of an ICWA case should be done in team, in collaboration, in consultation with the child's tribe. So what are some of those essential tribal roles in placement? Number one, active efforts. The agency must consult with the tribe and use available tribal resources or services when making placement of an Indian child. And as Linda stated, and I'm sorry, Linda, like it just occurred to me I never had you introduce yourself because we just rolled over from the last panel. So, but one of the things that, Linda reinforced in our last session, just a short while ago, for those of you who were in the room, is who best knows the families, who best knows who this child is connected to, who best knows the resources that might exist for placement. And that is their tribe. That's their, your ICWA representative, your ICWA advocate is going to have a lot of information that is really helpful in identifying what those placement resources might be. So that piece of consulting with the tribe, as early and often as possible is going to be really critical in complying with the ICWA placement preferences. Also, the tribe may and has the authority to establish a different order of placement preference by resolution. So, a slide before, 2 slides ago, we had those the list of the preferred placement options. The tribe may choose to alter or amend those specific to the circumstances of that case. So for example, if a family is going through active reunification and they live a geographical distance away from some extended family members who could and are willing to be placement, the tribe might opt to keep the child in close geographic proximity to their parents during the process of reunification so that they can have frequent and active visitation, for example, and really nurture that bond. However, if those reunification efforts are unsuccessful, then the concurrent plan may be to move that child across the state or wherever, auntie or grandparents live to be the long-term placement. So also another really critical and key point of, communication and collaboration is really honoring what the tribe's position and wishes are as it concerns placement of a child. If a child is not placed according to the placement preferences, the agency must prove good cause, including proof by clear and convincing evidence of a diligent search for a suitable Indian home. So again, the documentation of the efforts is really critical so that if the county agency does need to deviate from the placement preferences, it is really clear how and why that decision came to be. And because good cause really needs like substantial backup to go along with it. So what is good cause to deviate from the placement preferences? You may be wondering. Next slide. I think it's kind of maybe helpful to start with like what isn't good cause to deviate from the placement preferences. So, there's probably been many instances for those of us who have done this work for some time where we hear like the child is bonded, right? So maybe a baby was removed at birth. They were placed in a non-ICWA compliant placement, stranger care with a lovely family. And in the meantime, like Auntie has had to get a bigger house and like kind of rearrange her life so she's able to take in, her family members. And maybe that has taken 6, 7, 8, 9 months for that to happen. And at the point in time when Auntie is then ready and has the bigger house or has whatever she needed to do to be able to provide placement for her family members, we get met sometimes with well, this child is bonded. It's the only home that the baby has ever known. The family has fallen in love with her. They live in this beautiful gated community and give her all these, this wonderful life. And how detrimental will it be to this baby to then remove her from this only home she's ever known to this family that has absolutely fallen in love with her and really would love, to ultimately raise her forever. That is not justification to deviate from ICWA placement preferences. Ultimately, while yes, we're thrilled that that was successful for a temporary time, that is never justification. Never justification to deviate from ICWA placement preferences. And we know that in the long run, what ultimately is going to be most critical and important for that baby's life is the bonds and attachment she forms with who she is, where she comes from, and the people that she is connected to by blood relation, the lands where she comes from, and all of the strength that comes with that. I think we have a participant virtually who is unmuted. Please and thank you. It was Rebecca. So you see here before you too, like number 1, for example, the request of the biological parents to deviate from the placement preferences. That doesn't circumvent what is in the best interest of the child. So parents' wishes are not necessarily going to circumvent what is in the best interest of the child. So for example, parents come into this process and there's a lot of things in their lives that are out of balance, which has led to their child being in care, right? And some of that sometimes comes with strained familial relationships because of lifestyle choices, because of, bridges that have been burned that need to be mended. So maybe mom is like, I don't want, my child with my sister. I don't want my child with my mom. I don't want my child with, the paternal side of the family because, we don't have a good relationship there. It's not in a good way. That in and of itself isn't, justification to not comply or to deviate from the placement preferences. Again, it's always focused and centered around the child, which sometimes can get a little skewed because part of like the California integrated core practice model, for example, really promotes parent voice and choice. Yes, but let's not misinterpret that either to be out of compliance with the law. Next slide. ICWA authorizes tribes to approve homes for placement for their children that have been removed from the custody of their Indian parents. So it gives authority for tribes to kind of do that placing work, right? For tribes to do home approvals. Some tribes are even have moved and built capacity around licensing their own homes, doing background checks, all of those things we've been hearing about over the course of the last couple days in various panels and conversations. We also heard during the resource family approval and background check panel about the cultural and social standards. Oops, sorry, next slide. I just want to re-emphasize that integrating the cultural and social standards into the placement process, into the resource family approval process, may not be the same for every single family, and it's certainly not going to be the same for every single tribe. So it's a challenge where, you know, states and counties really want, it's helpful to have guidance, it's helpful to have things in black and white. What are the cultural and social standards for this tribe? So I can access that information easily, and it's just unfortunately not that simple. For example, where I come from in Humboldt County, very Northern California, very remote rural community and county. I've spent a number of years doing this work for the Yurok tribe. And even within the reservation of the Yurok tribe and its service area, we had a lot of tribal families and membership who lived along the coast in what would be the more, I mean, it's still not, it's hard to call it urban, but you know, it lived kind of in town, right? Where the most kind of urban and populous area of our county is. Very different from our families who lived up the river, still in the same county, still in the same tribal area, but lived in a very, like, took 2 hours to get there on very remote rural mountain roads. A lot of infrastructure has just recently come to that part of the reservation by way of internet power. Like a lot of families were still living, you know, generator power and otherwise. So even the placement, integrating the cultural and social standards into placements for a family up the river and in the mountains versus a Yurok family out town, also like not exactly the same, right? So really needing to collaborate again and team with the tribe around what those cultural and social standards are that are gonna be appropriate to be applied for each individual placement. All right, placement teaming. So certainly teaming around placement needs to occur at disposition and of course at permanency, but also needs to be happening anytime there is a disruption or a threat of disruption for placement. And when I say teaming, again, I'm talking about doing that rich and robust partnership work, collaboration work between county and tribe, right? And really honoring the tribe's position, honoring the tribe's lead and authority, and what needs to happen associated with moves or preserving placement or you know, what is going to be the concurrent plan in the event you know, the permanency is not to be back with the parents. So we'll talk a little bit about emergency placements, tribally approved homes, tribally specified homes, and resource family approval. All right. So tribally approved homes versus tribally specified homes. What are they? What's the difference? What do we need to know about that? So a tribally approved home, sometimes also called a TA for short, a home that has been licensed or approved by an Indian tribe for foster care or adoptive placements of an Indian child using standards established by the tribe. So I would love to hear a bit from Linda on her experience and what their processes were for approving homes, because every tribe does it different. You know, not every tribe has robust infrastructure to even approve their own homes. So for example, you might interface with a very small tribe. Maybe they have one, you know, representative like doing the ICWA work. Maybe they're new to the position and haven't, you know, don't come with a lot of background and experience in doing this work. Maybe there isn't like existing, you know, policies, procedures, protocols for them to utilize as a roadmap for how they approve homes. And then on the, you know, flip side, you have, you know, some tribes who are doing full-blown licensing, you know, running background checks, have developed, you know, foster care, foster parent training programs where they are orienting their families, they're recruiting their families, they're licensing their homes and providing robust support. So it's, again, going to be a spectrum and different from tribe to tribe. It is not required to also then be licensed by the state or county, yet it is equivalent to a state or county licensed home for the purposes of services as well as foster care funding. So the tribe approves the home. they submit documentation required to the county, and then those county dollars, those Title IV dollars, support that placement in the same way that if they would support a county licensed foster home. One other piece I just want to emphasize: services. So sometimes I feel like there is inconsistency with services that are provided by the county to tribally approved homes. So those homes are still entitled and should be offered, training opportunities that are provided for the county. There should still be, if there is like a certain amount of like case management or other supportive services or respite that, county has to offer, those same types of services and supports should be offered to tribally approved homes in the same way. Perhaps the family is like, no, thanks, we're good, but we'll let you know, but still that offering, sharing of that information, what those services and supports are, should equally be made available to a tribally approved home. So it's not like it's the tribe's home, hands off, the tribe's got it covered. We still have to have equity in what types of services and supports are provided. So oftentimes after the tribe has done their process of approving the home, going into the home, checking for, whatever needs to be checked for, safety threats, orienting the family, however they do so. Oftentimes there will be, whether it be, a formal letter on tribal letterhead or whatever the process is within your county to basically kind of establish that home has been approved. Next slide. Linda, in your experience, did you do your own approval process?
Your tribal court.
Tribal court?
Yeah.
Do you want to?
So we did when we were able to do our tribally approved homes. Actually, I got the home study from a tribe down in the desert, Agua Caliente. And then I just kind of like tweaked it because ours is more rural. Or Agua Caliente is like, what does it call it? Like a map. Different parts of Palm Springs belong to Agua Caliente. Same with Torres Martinez, part of the Salton Sea. So when I looked at theirs, it's like, ours is more rural. And we have to suit it for some of our people that live in town too. Because as long as they're our tribal members, we're able to tribally approve those homes. So what we did is we actually had CILS at that time do all of our children's codes, did all of our tribally approved homes after we took theirs, but what we wanted in ours, what schools were in our district, and how we wanted our kids to stay in the homes on the reservation or close to it. And the county was real easy to work because it's less work for them. If we do it, it's less work. But the one thing that the county does do for us is because we don't have like Season and Paula are able to do their background checks, and more tribes I know are doing it. Liz's agency does it for them too, but the county still runs the background checks for our people and does a fingerprinting just to make sure that, the homes that we're saying are the ones that we want to go in, we can't take that chance that, they have a record or something and, oh my God, I'd be devastated if something like that happened. But I think it's easier because we can go in those homes and it's not as strict, as what the county would say and have this many people to that, to that bedroom, we can't, things like that. And I think it worked out really, really well because we're able to place more of our kids with the forms that we have, sign off on it. Tribal chairperson signs off and says, okay, as long as you think that home's okay, and as long as they do the background check, we're fine with it. And I think when that happened, the flow, it helped because especially in emergency, like Liz was saying, sometimes we're picking them up on the side of the road, if their parents just like are drunk or something, and they just like, it's like, oh my goodness, and our tribe's able to remove also. There's a lot of times with the county, we work with the county, and they're like, we just don't have enough. It's like, well, we do. Give me your report, piggyback off that report, and we'll take it to tribal court. And then, I'll start right away. I know I have an aunt or an uncle or a cousin. And so, yeah, that's what we do. It was easier to do a tribally approved home.
And thank you for reminding us too that, the tribe has authority to approve homes on or off reservation. The tribe can travel, anywhere to approve a family member or whomever, is their preferred placement option. So it's not just within their tribal lands and boundaries, it's anywhere they see fit. Next slide. So a tribally specified home. So this is a home that the tribe designates as its preferred placement option for an Indian child who is in the custody of the county. And under a tribally specified home are still going to be going through the resource family approval process. So the county is, doing the more heavy lift in that regard of approving the home. But again, through that process, the county still has the legal requirement to apply the prevailing social and cultural standards of the Indian tribe. So, there might be like different, reasons why a tribe would specify opposed to approve a home. It could be due to resources again. So perhaps the tribe doesn't have the capacity or the infrastructure, or maybe it is, in a different county, or just, they don't have the ability to travel at that time or whatever it is. Or it might be a home that the tribe maybe isn't comfortable approving on their own, or they see it as having a higher level of need. So really want the county to kind of do their, robust process, as well as, provide the supports and services associated with, RFA homes and the RFA unit. But they're still, basically saying this is our preferred placement, and that should of course always be honored. All right, next slide. I'm not going to go too much into the RFA directives because we did kind of have a plenary about this, but just know, again, just re-emphasizing the teaming aspect of this. So even if the county is taking the lead and doing the RFA approval process, that it should still be done absolutely in team and collaboration. So the county should still be applying the standards of the tribal community to the home. They should still be, inviting and collaborating with your tribal partner to go into the home, assess the home, ask any questions, provide any, information together, as well as offer any collective supports. And certainly the sharing of the RFA written report should come to the tribe. The tribe should have that information and access to that information. A little bit about what might be an application of the tribal standards. So, again, where I come from, we're river people, so it is not uncommon for, to live in very close proximity to the river. Under an RFA process, there might be a requirement for non-native children, or, just all children, to have gated, boundary between, the home and, whatever water source there is. But for, our community, that would not be a requirement. That would not be something we would impose upon our families. Our children grow up learning how to interact with the river and the water, and learn kind of water safety in that regard, learn respect and distance and those types of things. So that would not be perhaps a standard that we would, seek to apply to a tribal family who's going through, a tribal house going through the RFA process. So that would be one example. Next slide, time check. Got 2 more minutes, folks. Just a couple quick reminders about applying the cultural and social standards. It is up to the tribe to determine who is considered a qualified expert witness. If there is a need for a QEW to provide testimony as to the applicable prevailing social and cultural standards. And then further, there is no pan-tribal standards that can be applied to all cases. So applying the cultural and social standards must be applied on a case-by-case basis, and again, at the leadership and kind of direction of the tribe. So next slide, again, it is tribal decision whether or not they are going to take on the responsibility and work of approving a home, or if they are seeking the family, or preferring the family to go through the RFA process. As Linda highlighted, in the RFA process, as well as in the approval process for some tribes, it will be the county who is doing the fingerprinting, and the county should be sharing that information. So if there are exemption hits, That should also be a time to apply the prevailing cultural and social standards of the tribal community. So for example, if there has been, say, a DUI conviction in the history and past of one of the adults in the home, the tribe can apply their standards of rehabilitation. So that individual doesn't necessarily have to have gone through, a conventional like treatment program. Perhaps in community, it is known that this person has engaged in, tribally and culturally appropriate recovery, efforts. Perhaps they've engaged in, tribal programming. They're involved in recovery community. Perhaps, they are even in a role of like leading sweats, for example, but they don't necessarily have a certificate that says I've completed treatment, in my past. So that's, again, just one example. So applying the tribe standards. And then again, just really partnering with the tribe at each step of the way in the RFA process. Next slide. All right, I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead. Just know that this is all available in the conference materials because we are out of time. There are also some additional resources in the PowerPoint. So access or links to specific all county letters associated with ICWA placement, including tribally approved homes. Also, the California Tribal Families Coalition did complete a report with key findings and recommendations with tribal input throughout the state on tribal customary adoptions and the resource family approval process that can be found on the website, as well as some other resources associated with placement. We are nearing the end of our time together and are out of time. I will hang out for a bit if there are any questions. But we just thank you for joining us today. Thank you for being committed to this work. Thank you for loving ICWA because I know we do. And thank you, Micah, for driving the PowerPoint from afar. You are the real MVP. You don't see is